its unique work in habitat connectivity and water quality and wildlife crossings and mitigating pipeline impacts and volunteer training through the Clean Water Advocates program and outdoor programming through webinars like this one that helps cement our connection to nature even if we aren't in it at the moment. If you'd like to join us and become a Wild Virginian, right here, we have some information and a QR code, or just go to our website at wildvirginia.org. You can find the information there about our campaigns and events and ways to donate that help keep our organization strong, because when it comes to nature, every dollar matters. Now, in terms of tonight's presentation, the great outdoors becomes more complicated when we contemplate invasive species that are basically competing with natural habitat on our private and public lands. And anyone who has spent quality time battling invasives knows how unsettling it is, because you realize the extent to which they're invading our forests and other wild places, and how quickly and radically they alter the natural environment. And in turn, this starts to interfere with our joy of being outdoors. So a number of us are in search of ideas, how to pitch in, how to help control invasives, what resources can we count on to do so, and what policy and advocacy efforts are underway. And that's why we thought it was so important to have Lauren Taylor, Executive Director at Ridge PRISM, which stands for Partnership for Regional Invasive Species Management, as our speaker tonight. PRISM is Virginia's statewide leader in invasive plant education and training and advocacy, and can help us mitigate invasive plants on the lands we steward. Just before we turn it over to Lauren, though, just a quick plug for our upcoming May 1st webinar on mapping wildlife vehicle conflict hotspots and how significant the wildlife rehab data is in expanding the accuracy of the conflict maps. And this is really important stuff, because as it turns out, Virginia is ranked the 9th highest risk state in the US for vehicle wildlife conflict. And with that, welcome Lauren Taylor. We're glad you're here, and let's hear about invasives.
Lauren, I think you're muted.
Are you seeing the screen?
Yep, looks good.
Okay, great. All right. We have a lot to cover tonight. We're going to get everybody on the same page and then dive into some of the impacts and the things that you can do. And touch here. So people listen to webinars, human beings, we listen in a funny way, which is really, what does this have to do with me and what's in it for me? So if you walk away this evening and you remember only 3 things, what I'd like you to remember is that invasive plants are all around us. They directly impact habitat connectivity, watershed health, and forest longevity, 3 of the things that Wild Virginians care the most about. And we are the cure. So we cause this problem, we can solve this problem. And so a quick introduction to this concept of plant blindness. So this term was coined in the late 1900s, and it refers to this concept that this is the John Warner Parkway leading into Charlottesville, that we can commute on this road every day and not look out the window and realize that we're driving through a valley of kudzu, for example. Or this is the GW Parkway in Northern Virginia, and people commute every day into DC and they don't stop and realize or look out the window and realize that the forest has become completely smothered with porcelainberry. This is the Fontaine exit leading into Charlottesville off of 29 headed south. And everything that you see in this photo, with the exception of a couple of Virginia pines in the background, every single species that you're looking at is an invasive species. And people drive this route all the time and they don't realize what they're seeing, and they don't realize the impact. we don't think about plants as being important, and yet they're the foundational building blocks of everything. Or that you could go to Penn Park in Charlottesville and watch this, walk this nature trail and look out, and what you're looking at is Oriental bittersweet destroying the canopy, and people walk by this all the time and not realize that. So I was asked to give a very short backstory how I got involved in this, and it began 11 years ago when I did a bucket list volunteer trip to help build the new Patagonia National Park in Chile. And we were tasked with, what drew me to the project was actually habitat connectivity, where we were removing barbed wire fences from old sheep stations to open up the corridors for some threatened wildlife to be able to move freely. And then we got down there and we were also tasked with removing invasive plants. So we were given some rudimentary tools, and in the center there we're removing common mullein, which was coming in through tire treads on the gravel roads running from Chile to the Argentine border and destroying the fields. And then we were asked to go up into the hills and gather seed for the world's largest grassland restoration project. So that was really eye-opening, and I didn't realize what a problem invasive plants were on the North American continent until I came home. And I'm an avid hiker. This is several years ago with my beloved dog, who has since passed. But this was our favorite park in Northern Virginia, and I did not realize for years we hiked this, that all of this understory that you see in here in the springtime, which felt so refreshing and green, was actually invasive privet and multiflora rose and wineberry. So I began to become aware of that. And then our other favorite hike on Theodore Roosevelt Island on the backside, crossing through the marsh in the springtime, this is an entire carpet of lesser celandine invading the swamp. We're going to talk about the impacts of some of these plants, but I began to become aware that this was all around me. This wasn't just a problem in South America. So I started volunteering, first in neighborhood community efforts, and then on public land, more private land. And then a little over a year ago, I joined Blue Ridge PRISM as the executive director. So really quickly, who is Blue Ridge PRISM? Again, Partnership for Regional Invasive Species Management. The generic term is Cooperative Weed Management Area. There are PRISMs or CISMs or CISMAs all over the United States, a little over 100 of them. If you live in the state of New York, the state there is covered by a network of 8 PRISMs. So every county in New York has a PRISM to turn to. And that's what we would like to see in Virginia. So we're the first PRISM. There is a new effort in the Northern Neck area and a nascent stage effort in Southwest Virginia. But that's what we'd like to see, is Virginia covered with a network of PRISMs. We cover 12 counties. We hope to pick up the other 2 up in the north western corner there. We cover 3.6 million acres, about 200,000 of which is Shenandoah National Park. And our core purpose is to improve the health of our natural world for future generations. That's why we get up and do what we do every day. We do that through educational presentations like this one, and tabling and site visits and online webinars and field training sessions, leading volunteer work days. We produce weed alerts and fact sheets. And most recently, the December before last, we gathered 85 partner organizations in Charlottesville for 3 days to create the Virginia Invasive Plant Coalition, which has its own website. It's run as a program of Blue Ridge PRISM. And on there, we have all the known resources in the state for landowner assistance, policy, speakers list, training programs, et cetera, in addition to all the resources that are already on the Blue Ridge PRISM website. So very quick primer so that we're all on the same page about invasive species, because you'll hear a lot of different terminology tossed around. And when we talk about invasive plants, we are talking about the legal definition of invasive species, which a lot of people don't realize there is a legal definition. So we're referring to Executive Order 13751, which is an update to the original 13112 from 1999. Where invasive species means with regard to a particular ecosystem. And that phrase is very important, because a plant can be invasive in New England, but be native here in Virginia or the prairie states. For example, our eastern red cedar is native here, but is wreaking havoc out west of the Mississippi. So with regard to a particular ecosystem, a non-native organism whose introduction causes or is likely to cause economic or environmental harm or harm to human, animal, or plant health. So that was the update, was the addition of animal or plant health. Originally, the executive order only said human health. So for all practical purposes, what we're saying here in Virginia is key number one, the plant was not here pre-European contact. Key number two, it has to cause harm. So we're not talking about dandelions that are a plant that people love to hate on, that are a non-native plant, but they are not creating monocultures or causing harm. So economic, environmental, human, animal, or plant health. How do they cause harm? Several different ways, including forming monocultures, blanketing the ground, crowding out native species, clogging waterways, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We're going to see some quick examples of those. Economic harm. Most of you are familiar with Bradford pear, Callery pear. It seems to be one of the most popular landscaping trees in Virginia. These were marketed as sterile cultivars, and it turned out they were anything but. When they get out into the wild, and we've just come through the period where these are in bloom all over the state, they invade our forest edges and our farmers' fields, and they have wicked 3-inch thorns on them that can puncture a tractor tire, costing the farmer thousands of dollars to repair, and they render these fields completely unusable. They cross-pollinated with other pears, and that's how they regain their fertility, or like we say in Jurassic Park, life finds a way. Environmental health, an example, is Japanese wisteria. People love the beautiful drapey purple flowers, but when they get into our woodlands, this is what happens. They take over absolutely everything, nothing eats it, and they will kill the trees, pull them to the ground, and render this an ecological dead zone. We're going to come back to this in a few minutes. Harm to human and animal health, an example of that is Japanese barberry, which is another popular landscaping plant that people love for the crimson color. When it escapes into the wild, it reverts to green, except for in the fall. This is what it looks like when it invades a forest floor. And Japanese barberry happens to create a microhabitat that harbors the ticks that carry Lyme disease. So imagine a forest filled with this much barberry, and the animals are trying to go through it, dogs, deer, etc., and picking up the ticks that carry Lyme disease. So we encourage people to remove these plants from their landscaping. So how did they get here? Some of them were intentional, like kudzu was originally brought here as an exotic and then used for roadside stabilization. Some of them were unintentional, like Japanese stiltgrass, which arrived here as dried packing material in crates from Asia, and they didn't realize that there were viable seeds hiding inside. This came from Kevin Heffernan at the Department of Conservation and Recreation. I think this is really important to understand the scope and scale of what we're dealing with. So little context goes a long way. There's approximately 400,000 identified species of plants on the planet. About 18,000 of those were native to the North American continent. Since European contact, humans have brought, intentionally or unintentionally, over 30,000 new species of plants onto the North American continent. And you'll notice that the invasion curve looks a lot like the climate curve in terms of globalization and recent increases in trade, really driving up that hockey stick, if you will. So of those 30,000 introduced species, roughly 5,000 have escaped. And they're not all problem makers, but approximately 925 or so have been identified as invasive in one state or another in the United States. So let's just take that in for a moment. Let's take a breath. Since the Jamestown settlement, we have dumped 30,000 plant species into a continent that previously only had 18,000. And those 18,000 had millennia to co-evolve with wildlife in their respective ecosystems. So how are they spreading? They are prolific seeders. They have tenacious rhizomes, rampant runners, sneaky fragments. Japanese knotweed can spread from a tiny fragment the size of my pinky fingernail, produce a whole new plant. Common vectors include birds, wind, deer, dogs, shoes, tire treads, waterways, and runoffs. So you can imagine in our natural areas where you have roads cut through or hiking trails, you have all of these things, which leads to our natural places being invaded by all of these species. They're opportunistic. Nothing eats them. They leaf out early. They retain their leaves longer than our native plants. And how is this impacting habitat connectivity? So I'm sure that most of you are familiar with a recent report that declared the number one cause of species extinctions is loss of habitat. So these invasive plants are altering habitat structure. This photo was not taken in Charlottesville, but it could have been along the John Warner Parkway. This is kudzu, otherwise called the vine that ate the sow. So imagine you're a bird and you're trying to figure out where to nest in this mess, or you're a deer or a bear and you're trying to make your way through this. This is completely cutting off habitat corridors. Again, this is an ecological dead zone. None of our native animals will eat this or derive any benefit from this kudzu. Not so fun fact, it's estimated that there are more than 7.4 million acres of kudzu now in the United States, and they go all the way up to Toronto. Another way that they impact connectivity, habitat connectivity, is they create barriers. So this is invasive wineberry. There isn't a good rendering of scale in this photo, but these create thickets up to 10 feet tall that become impenetrable. So they cut off wildlife movement across corridors. And it's hard to get people to get rid of these berries because they like the way they taste. And we encourage people to go for native brambles and please get rid of the wineberry. Another thing that they do to impact habitat connectivity is they displace native species. This is a blanket of porcelainberry that is completely smothering all the species underneath it. So there's no valuable food or shelter in this area. This is another area where everything you see is just a curtain or a blanket of invasive plants. This was in Penn Park last fall in Charlottesville. They impact ecosystem services. So this is a floodplain in Greene County. This should be filled with spring ephemerals. So this impacts pollination and habitat connectivity for our native bees. There's the top photo there. This is Hemerocallis fulva, otherwise known as ditch lily, orange daylily, tiger lily, tawny daylily, which is not yet listed as invasive in Virginia, but is in 5 surrounding states. So it's probably just a matter of time. But you can see how densely that's growing. And on the same day, the photo below was taken in Bull Run. This is what Virginia floodplains are supposed to look like on March 30th, where you have our beloved Virginia bluebells and spring beauty and dozens of different types of ephemerals. The angle that the lower photo was taken at makes it look like it's a monoculture of bluebells, but it's not. If you were standing over it, you'd be seeing many types of spring ephemerals. And why is this so important? We have 4,000 species of native bees in North America. About 400 of those are in Virginia. And some of those native bee species are so tiny, they're like the size of a sliver of a fingernail, and you only notice them when the sunlight glances against their wings. And when they come out of hibernation in the spring, the first thing they have to do is nectar. And some 25% of these native bee species are single species or single genus specific, meaning they have to find that one flower that they can nectar on, or they die. And so if they come out of hibernation and what they meet is the photo up above, where there is just a monoculture of daylily, which doesn't even have any flowers blooming yet. Some of these bees are so small they can only fly the distance of 1 or 2 city blocks. And you can see in the upper photo that daylily goes as far as you can see along these stream banks. And so these bees end up perishing in search of nectar. And then the flowers that require them for pollination, they die too. And little by little by little, our web of life begins to unravel right before our very eyes, and we're not paying any attention. This is a similar situation where this floodplain is invaded with lesser celandine, and you see there are no spring ephemerals there. So how is this impacting watershed health? This is what a typical creek or run or branch goes by different names in Virginia. This one happens to be leading to the Potomac watershed, but it could be leading to the Chesapeake. area as well. And you'll see that it's a mixed forest with many different types of hardwood trees, and they're dropping their leaves into the creek. And this is part of how our ecosystems here in Virginia evolved. This, unfortunately, this photo was taken just a few miles from the prior photo. This is the Pemmit Run Stream Valley as it passes through McLean, leading down to the Potomac. What you're seeing here, the entire stream valley, instead of being shaded over by our beautiful hardwoods, is solid Japanese knotweed, invasive Japanese knotweed, and the trees along the forest edge are completely draped in porcelainberry. So these invasive plants have pushed the forage edge back from the stream banks. And it's hard to get a sense of the scale, but if you were standing next to that Japanese knotweed, that's what it would look like. And look at the density. Nothing can get through that. So wildlife can't make it to the stream anymore. And this is how tall it grows, 12 to 15 feet tall. But what is this doing to the actual water quality itself? So this research was done in the Midwest, but it's just as applicable here. A healthy stream is shaded by the mature hardwoods, and that keeps the water cool. They drop a mixture of these hardwood leaves into the creeks or the streams or the rivers, and it forms a type of watershed tea. That tea feeds the macroinvertebrates that live in the stream, which then feed the insect larvae, which then feeds the birds and the spider populations and also feeds the fish populations. In the middle, what you see is as invasive plants begin to come in and destroy the tree canopy and push it back, and you get less diversity, what happens is the water begins to warm. And as the water warms, more carbon dioxide is released. People forget that water, the oceans, our rivers, our streams are our biggest carbon sinks on the planet. But as that water warms, more carbon is released. The watershed tea is diluted, so there is less food for the macroinvertebrates, less food for the insect larvae. Now you can't support the bird populations any longer. Maybe you can only support the spiders, and you're not supporting the larger fish. So this begins to create a negative feedback loop. Little by little, the rest of the trees die. Out west, in the Midwest, the species they're dealing with is tamarisk. So you could compare that to our Japanese knotweed. Now there's nothing left on the stream banks but the tamarisk. So the sun is warming the water. There is no more mixed hardwood leaf tea. You can no longer support the larger species of fish. You can't support the macroinvertebrates. Almost no insects are being produced. And you have a tremendous amount of carbon dioxide being released into the environment and warming. And again, the cycle just continues to get worse. So how is this impacting forest longevity? This is probably one of the most visible and significant impacts. And this goes back to the idea of plant blindness. So these two photos were taken approximately 1.5 miles away from each other on the exact same day last year. The first one is what we saw typical in Virginia just a few weeks ago when you're coming out of the long cold winter and you see the first signs of spring leaf out, and your heart, I know my heart as a hiker just thinks, finally spring is here. I'm so tired of winter. This is wonderful and I'm so happy to see this, not realizing that this time in March, if you are looking at green leaf out, these are not native species. It's too early for our native understory to be leafing out. That begins to happen in April. And so what you're seeing here is a forest completely invaded by autumn olive. So what? Who cares? It's green, it's a shrub. We think, maybe this is providing some type of ecosystem services. But what's happening is that shrub layer is preventing the sunlight from reaching the soil and warming it enough to germinate the tree seeds. And that matters because our trees have a lifespan and we forget about that. We think our trees last so long, we take them for granted. We think our forests have always been here. We think they will always be here. And we don't realize that while trees range in life, anywhere from 60 to 80 years to our grand old oaks can live hundreds of years, if not 1,000 years or more. The average tree is probably living somewhere between 80 to 120 years. So part of the cycle, those trees will die, and there need to be young trees and saplings that are replenishing them. When your forest is invaded in this way, there is no new regeneration. So the trees that are here are going to die, maybe not in our lifetime, maybe in our children's lifetime, and there will be nothing to replace them. So without intervention, without the removal of this autumn olive, what will happen when these trees die is we'll be left with nothing but giant thickets of autumn olive, and that's already happening in some places. So this is an example of Chinese privet invading a forest. The exact same thing is happening here, preventing forest regeneration. This is an example of burning bush, which is one of the most popular landscaping shrubs in Virginia. It invades the forest. Notice as you look across the forest floor that you see almost no small caliper trees. Almost all the trees have a uniform caliper, which tells you there's no regeneration or very little regeneration happening in this forest. This should be a 5-alarm fire warning flag. They also reduced the canopy. So this scene was happening along the 29 corridor, the 64 corridor. This is Japanese wisteria. And it is strangling these trees like boa constrictors along the forest edge. It will kill these trees underneath them. They cannot survive the wisteria because it digs into the cambium layer and cuts off the flow of nutrients up and down. This is extensive damage just south of 64 in Nelson County. So this is what happens when that wisteria progresses. You can see the canopy is completely gone from this area. What's left is rapidly dying. The same thing is happening here. This is more porcelain berry, which they're now calling the vine that ate the north. And so you can see that the trees underneath are not going to be able to survive this. And so these forests will disappear. Another way that plants are impacting forest longevity is a sneaky little habit called allelopathy. So that's the process by which plants emit chemicals into the soil to prevent other plants from germinating. So this is garlic mustard, which is blooming now. And if you see it, please pull it. So it starts off looking extremely innocent like this. Sometimes the leaves can even be mistaken for violets. But these are emitting chemicals that then allow it to become a carpet across the forest floor like this. And you'll notice you see very little regeneration happening here, no other species. In the first year, it produces these basal rosettes. And in the second year, the plant bolts and flowers, and each plant can produce, they estimate anywhere from 1,500 to 7,500 seeds. Within 10 years, you can have acres and acres of garlic mustard taking over the forest. And look across here, you see very little regeneration happening as well. No young saplings coming up. So what plants are invasive in Virginia and who gets to decide? It's not Blue Ridge PRISM, it's the Department of Conservation and Recreation. And right now we have 103 plants on the list. There were 13 added last year, and 54 of those are what we refer to, or what I call a true weed species, meaning nobody is growing these plants. Nobody grows or sells Japanese stiltgrass, for example, but 49 of these are still cultivated and sold in garden centers or online. And this is an area where you can really, really help. So some of the management challenges of dealing with all of these invasive plants on public lands is simply the landscape scale, the sheer vastness of some of these infestations, particularly the grasses out west like cheatgrass and brome and Scotch broom and the pampas grass, and then the lack of staff and the fact that these departments are all underfinanced. Virginia has had an invasive species management plan for over 15 years. And just last year, these agencies got the first funding to actually do anything about it. So it was an unfunded mandate for many years. On private lands, we have a cultural history that we're trying to address. For many years, importing exotic species for your garden was a sign of status and wealth. And that still happens to this day with a gardening ethic that we have to overcome. There's a lack of awareness, that danger zone of what we didn't know, or what we don't know, we don't know. And so we're still selling things like English ivy, despite the fact that they're destroying our forests. And then once people do become aware, it becomes a matter of time and money. So people can be resource constrained, and there are limited cost share programs to help people deal with invasive plants on their property. So how can you help? Fortunately, there are a tremendous number of ways that you can get involved. No formal training required. I certainly started this with no formal training. I'm not a scientist. I'm a business major. But the first thing that you can do is start learning how to identify these. If you love the outdoors and you're a hiker, so this is jet beet, which looks a lot like our dogwood, but it is not a dogwood. This is an invasive plant, and it's about to start blooming throughout the forests in the Commonwealth. We encourage everybody to get a good plant ID app on your phone if you don't already have one. Most of the people I know, we favor picture this. Because it tends to be about 85 to 90% accurate. None of them are perfectly accurate. It is crowdsourced information, but picture this is really a pretty good one. And then a second step, we have on our website, we've built a web-based app that you can use on your phone, and we've plugged in all 103 species, and each one has a photo essay with information on when to remove and how to remove. The photo essays will take you through the seedling stage all the way through the leaf out, any identifying features, what the flowers look like, what the seed pods look like. And if there are comparisons of native plants and their invasive cousins, we'll give you side-by-side photos to help you make sure that you're identifying the plant properly. We also recommend the Virginia Flora app. If you love plants and are native flora, it's a wonderful app on your phone. It includes everything that you see in the giant coffee table on the right and pictures. Much more fun. This is a great app to have on your phone. I go back and forth between these three resources every day, multiple times. When you find invasive species and you're out in the wild, we encourage you to report sightings. This is an easy thing to do. There are at least 3 different tools that you can use to do that. I find iNaturalist is really easy to use. The scientific community likes EdMaps. It's a little more cumbersome. And then there's WildSpotter, which is also tied to EdMaps. WildSpotter was specifically designed for mapping invasives in America's wild places. It's a pretty new app. But please do report these. The scientific community and folks like the Ridge PRISM, we use these to track the spread and to see what's happening in our area. So this is a really easy thing that you can do that can help. We also encourage you, if you're out and about, keep a boot brush in your car. These are a couple of dollars on Amazon, and research has shown that this actually makes a difference. Trail paths and roadways are one of the biggest vectors for the spread of invasive plants, and brushing off the treads of your shoes and brushing off your boots and even brushing your dog if you're hiking with your dog. These are really important things that you can do to help stop the spread. You can volunteer. Just this past weekend, we had a garlic mustard pull in Riverview Park in Charlottesville. It's a lot of fun. You'll learn the plant when you get there. You don't have to need to know anything when you go. And there's a sense of community in terms of helping make our wild places better for everyone. You can also make a massive difference by stopping it at the source. So we say, please just say no to these 49 species that are on the invasive plant list that are still being sold in the trade. And another way that you can help is to sign and share the petition. We're asking Home Depot to stop selling invasive plants. We're about to close in on 82,000 signatures. We targeted Home Depot because they control the vast majority of the retail garden center market. And once we get Home Depot to agree, then we will also target Lowe's, which has the second biggest section of the retail garden market, and so on down the road. But you've got to get the 800-pound gorilla to agree to stop selling these first. When you get more familiar with these species, if you have a house and a yard or a larger property or a farm, you can start taking inventory on your own property and learn how to properly remove these species. Some of them, it's as easy as pull and leave it to decompose. Some of them need to be bagged and trashed. Some of them you can compost, but we have all of that information for you. It's very, very rewarding. Choose native plants. The Plant Virginia Natives campaign has books for every region of Virginia. Support your local native plant nurseries. Talk to your state legislators. We produce call scripts, fact sheets. This is our white paper from last year. We're about to write a new white paper for this year. You may have heard that we just got the governor to sign the new bill that's going to require signage in retail garden centers. If they're going to sell an invasive plant, they at least have to put a sign to educate consumers. So this is a baby step in the direction of, we ultimately want these plants to be banned from commerce, but it's going to take a few years to get that accomplished in Virginia. So we really encourage you to talk to your state legislators and tell them how much you care about this issue and that you don't want invasive plants in the trade. If you're really gung-ho, you can get your neighbors together and start what we call an area steward program. If you live in an HOA, residents are banding together and taking on, this happens to be Tree of Heaven in a common area in an HOA in Ashburn, Virginia. We're seeing more and more area steward programs cropping up, and we're going to be hosting a webinar this summer about how to get your neighborhood associations involved in tackling invasive plants. So I just want to end with a really quick story of hope. This is a very personal to me story. So going back to this picture of Japanese wisteria, I took this on my father's property during COVID in Northern Virginia. My dad is 87 and doesn't go out into his the empty lot next to him in woods any longer, but wisteria had invaded it and was killing his beloved trees. Wisteria was never planted on his property, and we don't know exactly where it came from, but in this photo, everything you see that is green, every single leaf is wisteria, far back into neighboring properties as well. And when I discovered that, I decided I was going to have to do something about it. So August 2021, I set about hand cutting every one of these vines that you can see. And it's hard to tell scale, but this is chest high wisteria. So you couldn't walk through it. You could bushwhack your way through it, but I had to cut this vine by vine by vine. And so you can see the damage that it does where the vines, after they were cut, you can see how they dig into the cambium layer there. On the left, all those arrows are pointing to the vines attacking the tree from every different direction. So now it's November. It took me months to cut all of this, and the area looked like this. A number of the trees, you can see the bark had already fallen off. It was too late. These trees are all dead underneath, a number of them. You can also see where wisteria can bend mature trees all the way to the ground. There were 3 trees that looked like this. A forester told me that wisteria can rip mature trees right out of the ground. It's so powerful. So we waited out the winter, and now it is March of 2022, and I'm looking across this landscape, and my first thought was, oh my gosh, what have I done? It's barren. And did I harm the forest in some way? And should I be buying seed or replanting, or what should I do? And I reached out to some state botanists. Should I order some native wildflower seed mixes? And all of the experts said, just wait, take a deep breath and just wait and be patient. And sure enough, 3 weeks later, and remember, it looked like that on the left, and now it looks like the photo on the right. And April 13th, I went out to go inspect, and all of these native species were coming out of the seed bank, just waiting for the sunlight to warm the soil enough to allow them to germinate. They had been hiding there all along, shaded out, crowded out by the wisteria. So we had violets and Virginia jump seed and ranunculus and carex species and silver maples and red maples and asters and goldenrods and white avens and Christmas ferns and black cherries and eastern red cedars, American hollies, pinkster bloom azaleas. I could go on and on. It was just magnificent. Made my heart so happy. And it was all just one vine at a time. So I'll end by saying that we can all play a role in reversing the spread of invasive plants. Every little step that you take matters and makes a huge difference. And remember, we are the cure. And thank you.
Thank you so much, Lauren, for that wonderful presentation. I'm going to pass it over to Contessa, our fellow, to read off some of the questions that we have in our Q&A. And please, if y'all have any questions, go ahead and put them in the question and answer section.
Okay, so the first question is, what was the world's largest grassland restoration project?
That was the creation of Patagonia National Park in Chile. So they connected 3 different park areas by buying up a number of sheep ranches in the valley in between. And it took many, many, many years, but they eventually created, I forget how large it is compared to our parks, but that was the project.
Okay. And the next one is, have there been any studies on the impact of deer management or native plant resiliency and as a potential aid to control invasive plant spread?
There are lots of studies with regard to deer. The white-tailed deer population is, so I remember when I was a kid growing up, white-tailed deer population had fallen drastically low. And so there were hunting licenses and things put into place. Those programs were over-successful. So we now have a tremendous overpopulation of white-tailed deer, and that is creating tremendous pressure on native plants. And unfortunately, they don't eat the invasive plants. That's one of the ways that invasive plants spread as much as they do. So deer management is an extremely important part of rehabilitating any natural area. The carrying level of deer in any particular location is determined by a number of different factors. So it's not a fixed X number of deer per acre or X number of acres per deer. Depends on where you are in Virginia. But if you, like the property I moved onto, I'm thinking about putting up deer exclusion fencing in a small area because the understory is completely eaten. So I have mature trees and I have no understory whatsoever. And anything I've tried to plant, the deer just eat. There's routinely 6 or 8 deer outside my window. So very, very important. Lots of research in that area.
All right. And how much does climate change enhance their growth in areas and make it more difficult to eradicate them?
So we're very careful about ever using the term eradicate. So I didn't show a slide, but there's a classic invasion curve that's the seam curve that looks like product life cycle, product adaptation. So we only talk about eradicating invasive plants when they first arrive, and there are tiny, tiny, tiny populations of them. And that's what makes the practice of early detection, rapid response so important. And we put out lots of alerts when a brand new species has been identified in an area. After that, we really talk about control and management. So there are organizations that are studying the impact on climate. One of the things that we're seeing is as temperatures are warming, some of the species that weren't surviving our winters before, so they're really bad down south, those are starting to migrate northward. Things like Kogan grass is making its way up to North Carolina. Kogan grass and Japanese knotweed are the #1 and #2 worst invasive plants globally. Kogan grass, so we're very worried about that one as it starts to cross over the border into Virginia. What's also happening is that climate has a role in Western wildfires, and that again is a negative feedback loop. So the grasses that I mentioned earlier provide fuel because they connect the open spaces between plants that would be in those ecosystems. So for example, sagebrush is supposed to have bare ground between it, but the cheatgrass fills that in, and that cheatgrass dries out, creates a fire. The fires are now burning hotter, faster, longer, and longer wildfire seasons, which is then releasing more CO2 into the environment, warming the environment, and again, the whole cycle just kind of gets worse and worse. Did I answer that question?
Next, what laws and regulations and general horticultural practices are there today to prevent the introduction of new invasive in this country compared to what has happened in the last 20 years?
So to my knowledge, there are few to no laws or regulations that are preventing new species from being introduced into the United States. The horticulture industry brings lots of plants in all the time. It's this assumption of you're innocent until proven guilty. And that's a real problem. And it's one of the things policy-wise that ultimately we would like to see new species be vetted before they're brought in. But we're a long way from seeing that happen. And from a states' rights perspective, the state of Virginia is very pro-industry. And it's taken us many years just to get the retail signage up. The Virginia Nursery Landscape Association has really lobbied very, very hard to be able to sell whatever they can grow and make money from.
Right. Do you prioritize a specific area to clean up or a specific aggressive invasive species in order to see/make a difference?
I'm sorry, missed the very last part of that. I got the prioritized species.
In specific areas to clean up or a specific aggressive invasive in order to see or make a difference.
Gotcha. So when we talk about prioritizing, so timing is everything. We talk about training people to run the marathon, not the sprint. So rather than jumping into the thick of things, we encourage people to look, first of all, take inventory, understand how many different species do you have, what volume are you dealing with, and then create a management calendar to spread the load, because you can wear yourself out very, very quickly and then throw up your hands and give up. And so when we look at prioritization, we talk about, particularly here in Virginia, we want you to save the canopy first. So focus on vines that are killing trees. We can plant baby trees until the cows come home. We cannot make up for the carbon sequestration of mature old trees. So we really need to save our forests. If you have early detection rapid response species, you've got to get on those right away. And likewise, we have 6 species in Virginia that we have identified as what we call 5-alarm fire species. Some of these are brand new, early detection, and some of these, like Oriental bittersweet, have been around a long time, but for some reason, in the last 3 years, we are seeing an exponential explosion of bittersweet across the landscape, and it's taking out our tree canopies. So we encourage people, no matter how large or small the infestation of bittersweet is on your property, that you get on top of these 5-alarm fire species. So we talk about working from the top down. So saving the canopy, then the shrub layer, and then the ground layer. And then once you're working on a particular species, we encourage you to prioritize. If you were to take a bird's eye view, work from the outside in. So you're working from the area of least infestation toward the area of densest infestation. And that's not necessarily intuitive, but what helped me wrap my arms around the concept was, if you think in terms of square footage, like how do I get the biggest bang for the buck, clearing the biggest area of square footage from invasives to allow the natives to naturally regenerate. And that's by removing the isolated populations from the outer rings and then working your way and trying to contain the densest part in the middle until you can get to that too.
All right, I'll go ahead and jump in on the next question. Someone asked, what do you do with these invasives once you've removed them? And are they safe to compost, or does that further the spread?
So that is going to vary dramatically by species. So for example, garlic mustard, we tell people you need to bag and trash that. Don't ever compost it. When you pull garlic mustard, the plant is very sneaky. It still has enough energy stored in its roots to continue to produce seeds all the way until those seeds are ripe and the seed pods explode. Some plants you can pull right out of the ground and just turn them upside down so the roots are exposed to the air, like wineberry. and the roots will dry out, and that's the end of that. And so we try to provide that information in their resources on our website, because it really does vary. Some you can throw in the compost pile, some you can burn, some you can't.
All right, and then someone would like to know, who do we contact in Southwest Virginia for this organization, like in Carroll, Grayson, White County area?
So you can, depends on what information you need. So if you're looking for education, Blue Ridge PRISM is right now has the most educational resources out there. If you're looking to volunteer in a park, you could get in touch with your county park system. You can also look to see if there are national parks who might have a volunteer program. But in terms of the vast majority of educational information, that's going to come from Blue Ridge PRISM. We cover the entire state when it comes to education and awareness.
When you removed the wisteria from your father's property, did you actually pull the roots out, and how did it come back the next year?
That is a fabulous question. So the truth is, so with wisteria, they send down tap roots. So it's kind of energy prohibitive to try to dig up all the tap roots. So wisteria spreads by two means. It drops seeds, or birds drop the seeds, and it spreads by runners that go hundreds of yards across the ground. And at the nodes, they drop down tap roots, and then they send up a new shoot that tries to become a shrub that looks for something to climb on and eventually finds a tree and ladders up. So the big mistake that I made the first time around is that I was determined to vanquish the beast without using herbicide. And wisteria is what made me a convert. So there are a number of plants that you don't need to use herbicide for. You can dig them, cut them, mow them, scalp them. Wisteria is not one of those. So what happened with the wisteria is that it all came roaring back from the roots. And I had a professional come and visit the property, and she looked at it and she said, this was a professional contractor, and she said, there's absolutely no way you're going to be able to deal with this wisteria. Plus, because it was still coming in from neighboring properties, without treating it with herbicide. So your two options are to cut each stem and dab a little bit of herbicide very carefully on the cut stem, and that will soak down into the roots. Or you can do a foliar spray and spray glyphosate on the leaves to take it back. But there are a handful of plants. Tree of Heaven is another one that you absolutely cannot get rid of without using a targeted approach with herbicide.
Okay. Who can we ask to look at our woods to tell us about overgrazing by deer or invasive plants we can eliminate?
Every county has a forester program, and you can get foresters to come out and take a look at your property. If you are within our 12 county geography, where we do boots on the ground work, we have a site visit program for the 12 counties on the map there. But county foresters will come out and look at your property.
What about the use of drone technology to identify and treat invasive outbreaks, particularly in more remote areas?
That is a fabulous question. So we are very supportive of the research that's happening right now. Drones. Drones are being used successfully in agriculture in different ways. And there has been some exciting research down in Brazil about identifying and treating an invasive species of pine in coastal areas, where they find that it cuts the cost of identifying and the cost of treating like by 1/3, or not by 1/3, but 1/3 of what it was and 1/7 of what it was. So UVA has been conducting research, and the Department of Forestry is conducting research on autumn olive, and they have succeeded in using drones to map the invasive plants. They're using, I can't pronounce this, but one of our board members can pronounce this, but it has to do with some type of spectral imaging. Every plant sends off a different signal. And so the next step of that research that we are trying to get funded, or trying to help UVA get funded, is to automate the process of transferring the information from the identifying drone, that mapping process, into the treatment drone, because it's two different pieces of equipment. And right now what has to happen is the mapping drone comes and you download that information and then re-upload it to the treatment drone. And they want to prove that they can automate that and speed up the process. So lots of exciting stuff is happening in the world of drones. And we would like to do anything we can to speed up that research and make that a reality. The tough part is going to be that it's going to be difficult to operate drones inside a forest, but along forest edges or in floodplains, for example. I can't wait to see them using drones on Japanese knotweed in the Chesapeake Bay watershed. That will be really, really important.
Right. Is there any existing proactive legislation, at least when it comes to imported plants or natural resource health?
I missed the middle word there. So is there any legislation?
Wait, is there any existing proactive legislation, at least when it comes to imported plants or natural resource health?
Proactive legislation. I can't think of something specifically that's proactive. I can tell you that this coming year, what we're going to focus on for January, for the next General Assembly session, is to get the language. So Virginia has a funny law that talks about commercial viability, and this is what's preventing us from banning these plants from trade. So in the Virginia Code, there's a law that says that as long as a plant is considered commercially viable, in other words, you can grow it and sell it and make money off of it, you cannot ban that plant. And so until we get that language removed from the noxious weed law controls what plants are banned from sale or trade or movement. Until we get that language moved from the noxious weed law, we can't be proactively moving any of the currently sold plants over to the noxious weed list, which will prevent them from being sold. So these are the baby steps along the way, but I don't know that I could name any policy out there other than we have a Virginia Invasive Species Management Plan, but the agencies responsible for it desperately need more funding and more staff to be proactive.
Is a PRISM chapter in the future for Southeast Virginia?
So the new one that is getting started is in the Northern Neck region, and right now they're operating underneath the local Virginia Native Plant Society chapter. There isn't anything in Tidewater right now, but we are always open to the Blue Ridge PRISM. The Department of Forestry are trying to get more PRISMs up and going. So anyone who's interested in starting one, please reach out to us. One of our board members is very much involved in supporting DOF and getting those going.
Right. Is there a sister organization of Blue Ridge PRISM in Northern North Carolina?
That's a good question. I don't know. I could find out, but I don't know.
All right, and that was all the questions I had.
Those are great questions. Thank you, everyone.
All right, well, I want to thank everyone for joining us, and Lauren for your incredibly enlightening presentation. I think you've inspired us all. I do want to remind folks on the call that if you're looking for control methods, you can go to the Blue Ridge PRISM site. So if you've already identified or you've used the PRISM app to identify some invasives on your property, you can go to the Blue Ridge PRISM website and locate the control method that's appropriate to that invasive. And secondly, there are native alternatives to a lot of stuff. There are native alternatives to multiflora roses. There's a Virginia rose, right? There are even native alternatives to wisteria. So dig a little deeper. Thank you all so much for joining us tonight. Really appreciate your time.
Thank you.